Placemake Earth. And we also have our state senator, Rosemary has joined us, and we're very happy to have her. And she has a shorter time frame. Hi, Rosemary, are you here?
I am. Hi, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. We're so happy that you're joining us today. Can you give us an overview of your technology initiative? Okay, first, let me just recap the conversation so far. We have Lindsay with us. She is a PhD candidate with University of North Carolina, and she's doing her thesis on design thinking and transportation, and she's focusing on efforts here in Pontiac. We have Placemaking US, which is a national network connected to international networks of placemaking, and I'd like them to give a brief overview. And we had Friends of the Pontiac Parks founder, Minister Kathalee, is with us, and we were deep diving a conversation about the $3 million deal that just got voted down for the Pontiac Youth Recreation Center for the Golf Drive location, and talking about, we've always been advocates for kids downtown and shifting that possibly to the Phoenix Center, which is now out of all of the hassles and into a public-private partnership and wide open for development ideas. And so within that context, could you give us you're a big technology advocate, and maybe if you could give us a big picture overview of the American Rescue Plan and what that means for local communities and specifically technology, as we're seeing so much need in the schools for that kind of assistance.
I am happy to talk, but I feel like I don't have any context for the conversation. I'm not sure how it fits into what you're trying to do today. I don't want to just sort of ramble to myself.
From a design point of view, Rosemary, we're really looking to figure out a construct that addresses, a trilogy of simplicity in terms of the way in which broadband is impacting our daily lives, and the way in which work from home and learn from home are being facilitated by broadband. And then in addition to that, how that addresses transportation, because transportation is definitely going to be addressing a lack of funding currently, and maybe even more so as it goes forward with regards to people working from home and not taking transportation so seriously anymore, which I think is a huge mistake, that transportation is going to go by the boards for lack of need. I think it's always going to be needed and needed deeply, and maybe more now than ever. But from a broadband perspective, that certainly makes a great case, and we're all recognizing that we're learning the hard way in terms of learning from home, but working from home is really an interesting proposition when the kids are watching how they're going to be working in the 21st century. And yet that's not what they would be experiencing in traditional education.
True. Yeah, you're right. I mean, in the sense that it opens up incredibly new rounds of conversation on, it's interesting when you get thrust into this kind of crisis, right? You feel like you are reacting to emergency all the time. How are we going to make sure that kids get an education? How are we going to make sure that people can work and people can get access to healthcare? And everything is an emergency, and we're just reacting all the time. One of the things that I did technically before COVID hit, I had been working on a statewide broadband project, right, to try to find ways to leverage resources that we already have, to pull together different groups that are working on things and really focus on the whole state. How can we do this? Who do we get to help us? And then all of a sudden, whammo, here's this crisis. And so we had to react to that. We had to find a way for this thing that I was trying to do, is get every kid broadband. And now all of a sudden we just had to get every kid to school, right? Every kid to some way, something that looked like education. And so we did a quick turn. We turned that off. We turned it off, and we stopped talking about all the other things that were associated with that. And we started focusing on this relief or emergency reaction plan. And we did do some good things there. We filled some pretty significant gaps from an emergency perspective. But I feel like, looking back, we learned more about what we need. So I think that might be more valuable than the fact that we filled some gaps temporarily. We leveraged some interesting technologies. We use school buses. Speaking of transportation, we use school buses all over the state. We use special ed teachers who were driving out to visit students because they couldn't get into school. So special ed teachers would drive and school buses would drive hotspots. So anybody that took a vehicle and went anywhere would have a hotspot on it, and they would visit where kids were to try to give them access. So the goal of the emergency relief project was to give every child access to the network for some part of every day. So it's not broadband and it's not all day, but for some part of the day, they could have an exchange of information with their teachers or somehow provide access to the network. In some cases, it was entirely and still is entirely about affordability, not about lack of access. So one of the things we learned was that critical need for information, the critical need for flexibility in solutioning, right? So you can't go into a situation, whether it's an emergency situation or a long-term, big, huge plan, like let's get the whole state wired for broadband, already knowing the answer, right? So this is in the software world, the technology world that I come out of, Agile. You guys are probably familiar with this, right? Agile development.
Right.
You have to be able to take a step, test, and then do something with it, and then take another step and learn from every step. So a lot of what I think happened throughout this last year in our emergency reactions, you can almost think of that as Agile programming, right? We took steps, we learned some things. Now we're going to take some more steps. In my, we allocated $25 million to do this emergency access to networks project. That project is done. In the course of it, as that thing got rolling, one of the first things we learned was, boy, do we lack data. We thought we knew a lot about what was out there and who needed what kind of help, but we learned a lot about what we don't know. And so the very next thing that we started as part of this, stepping forward through the emergency, we actually got some outside partnerships through foundation funding and organizations that are interested in helping for different reasons on different pieces to start looking at, okay, how do we assess the whole environment? How do we start to really understand where the problems are and what's our next step? So starting to just, build into the next step in this agile development process, what can we learn today? Kind of like that. So that project is continuing. I would say that we've, in the old sense, we've converted now back into the idea of a statewide broadband, but really what we're doing is continuing this agile project and adding another layer and another piece and more partners and more development every step of the way. We're just adding a little bit more and a little bit more. And you uncover new barriers every time you take a step. And so you overcome barriers and then you see what's behind that barrier and you take another step. So I feel like we've made a lot of progress this year. In education, it's a much broader conversation, but I think it's exactly the same. Every teacher and every family with kids trying to do school at home or in whatever new environment they're working in is learning every day almost, right? What works and what doesn't work. And then we tried this next thing and that works, but now we've got another barrier we have to overcome and we move forward. So if, maybe the biggest thing that we're going to pull out of this is that we've been forced into learning how to do agile development. We've been, just by having a whole year. I mean, when you think about emergencies, right, the emergency room where, you are badly damaged and you go in there and somebody immediately takes note of you and fixes you, right? That's an emergency and we solve it. You don't have an emergency that goes on for a whole year. And you think about the impact of that kind of stress and that kind of intensity on everyone for a whole year. And I know we've heard, I'm going to go off on a tangent a little bit, but I won't go anywhere very far, but the mental, social, and emotional impact of being in a state of emergency for a long time. It compares most to some of the issues that we see in underserved communities and low-income communities that have been that way for a long time. When you are under stress like that for years, what it does to your social, emotional, and your mental, and all the other capabilities. So we all got to experience that in a small way by having a year's worth of crisis on our hands. And I feel like we're stuck. What's that?
Experiential learning.
Experiential learning. Yes, that's
Right.
that's exactly right. Because I come out of technology, I call it agile development, but it's the same.
And that leads to innovation.
We call it wicked problems. You're immersed in the wicked problem.
Yeah, yeah, we have definitely been immersed in some pretty wicked problems this last year, that's for sure. But we do have some good news on some of the new things. No, go ahead and ask.
So to your point, the opportunity to experiment within the confines reminds me of the 80s and the 90s when technology was just kind of blushing. And you might think of it as we were tinkering for the last maybe 30 years. And now we have some kind of salient point of reference and capacity that is looking for a target. And I think you just outlined it. And particularly as regards to education, the really amazing thing about education is the kids are already prepared. And yet we have very few things in the traditional education system that allows them to showcase those talents.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, in many ways, we hold people back, right? We hold kids back. We constrain them into the boxes they're in. And yeah, one of my early projects, before this job, I had a technology company, and we worked only with nonprofits and schools, and so we had worked on a system where it was designed to interconnect. Right, so it was designed to enable what's called backpacking, right, carrying your credentials with you. So as you learned something, whatever it was, you had some kind of recognition or badge or some kind of credential that said, I now know this thing. And so the system was designed to keep track of that and allow you to carry it with you for the rest of your life. Because it's not just for kids, of course, you should be learning. We are all learning all the time. So kind of the idea of and then that opens up the capability of what we're doing now is finding information or ways of learning things through all kinds of other channels that we never had before, right? It has always been that you would go to third grade classroom and there's your teacher and there's your fellow students and there's the board in front of the room, and that's how things work. And this year, that's not how things worked at all.
So is there any opportunity to experiment? And is there any, we know where there's some funding, is there any way that we can create something kind of offline that addresses these things that might take months, if not years, if we're going to go the traditional circuitous route of let's get this approved? Laughing, that's good.
Yeah, that is a good question. It's odd for me because, in technology, you do tend to just do things, right? You do things, you try things, you, at least in development, right? You try to solve problems as quickly as you can. And I did not sit as well in large companies. Obviously, I ended up with my own company because I didn't like the overhead or the slowness of a lot of things that happened. Well, now I'm in government, which is, like the opposite of fast, right? It's the opposite of agile. It's all those things.
Well, we want to get you out of the black box.
Yeah, that's one thing that the combined participants here could help with. In bottom-up placemaking is all about doing things from the bottom up. We're talking about Earth Day today. We're talking about walkable cities, high-speed internet access downtown, getting kids connected to their parks and using technology that way. What'd you say? Ryan, can you speak to that at all with
yeah, absolutely.
So what placemaking is and all of that, all this challenge we're in right now?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? Because I think my internet's a little funny, but
I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So essentially, I'm with Ryan Smolar with the Placemaking US network, and we're a network of hundreds of people across the United States, just like Monica and Jim, who are very actively engaged in a place-based development of their community. Awakening the economics, awakening the community pride, creating incremental positive change in transportation systems, in access to neighborhood health and wealth, and all of that good stuff. And so there's people embedded across the country who have different expertise, like Monica and Jim have really shared this mural mapping strategy of how they do visioning and mind work and collecting all types